Hi everyone, welcome back to One Fall Theory, where our subscribers are looking to learn more about professional wrestling, whether it be the history of the sport or its cultural significance as an art form, by researching and discussing as many credible sources as possible. In today's video, we'll be looking at Controversy Creates Cash, the 2006 Eric Bischoff autobiography, co-written by Bischoff and Jeremy Roberts. Specifically, we're going to be covering the passage of the book where Bischoff outlines the monumental deal he orchestrated that partnered WCW with Disney. In 1993, Eric Bischoff won his unlikely appointment as executive producer of WCW and began a journey that would seem raise WCW's perception and profit to truly contend with Vince McMahon's WWF. Bischoff would change the face of professional wrestling forever with the creation of WCW Nitro and go on to defeat the WWF in the television rating wars for 83 consecutive weeks. But exactly how did he accomplish this? The following excerpt from Controversy Creates Cash provides us with some insight into how a deal with media powerhouse Disney helped catapult this struggling regional promotion to pop culture success. Please stick around, as at the end of the passage, I'll share my thoughts on how this deal influenced all future success that WCW enjoyed. In late 1993, I took a trip down to Orlando, Florida to check out Disney MGM Studios. I thought that, if it were possible to shoot our syndicated show on a soundstage at Disney World, we could turn perceptions around. It was a much smaller venue than those we'd been using, but we had the ability with camera technique to make it look a lot bigger than it really was. It had better production and lighting facilities, so the shows would be more colourful and bright. We could shoot 3 or 4 shows a day, every day, for 6 or 7 days, saving a lot of money. And we'd have train cars full of fresh audiences who all had their teeth. The people visiting Disney for the most part weren't wrestling fans, but we didn't have many of those anyway. All we had were winos and brown paper bags. From a purely television point of view, an advertiser's point of view, and a syndication point of view, shooting at Disney would give us a product that looked a whole lot better than what we'd been producing. It wasn't ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but it would be a vast, vast improvement. More importantly, I knew that if our show could open with an announcer saying, "Coming to you from Disney MGM Studios in Orlando, Florida," and combine that with a wide cover shot of the Disney Towers, the perception of WCW as a tired regional promotion would immediately change. As incongruous as this may seem today when you think about it in relation to a wrestling company, the fact that we co-branded with a powerhouse like Disney would help us in a big way with advertisers as well as with audiences. It would make us look like a national operation. We could finally be seen as competition. But shooting a wrestling show at Disney MGM Studios, where Mickey Mouse is, and Pluto, and Donald Duck, are you crazy? I went from being a heretic to being the Antichrist. There were certainly negatives to the idea. A soundstage was a soundstage, and it didn't have an arena feel. This soundstage could only hold 800 people, and the audience would be primarily vacationers who came from Disney, and not to see us. For the most part, they wouldn't be following our storylines or get into our characters, but overall, the pluses far outweighed the negatives. Bob Due, Don Sandifer, Ole Anderson, Sharon Sadello and Gary Juster, head of arena relations at the time, all thought I should be hung by their neck until dead. And frankly, it wasn't just the Bob Dues of the world who thought that I'd lost my mind. Dusty Rhodes, who I get along with just about as well as anyone, was reluctant at first. Most wrestlers couldn't imagine producing the show in a soundstage. It was a real battle. There were weeks and weeks of meetings and debate back and forth. Everybody had a point of view, and none of them agreed with me. Finally, Bill Shaw got involved. Bill thought it was an out-of-the-box idea, a little progressive, not necessarily in a good way, but he finally said, "Quit your bitching and belly aching, we're doing this." As wacky as the debate got inside the offices of WCW, it was nothing compared to the reaction to the 7 to 10 Disney executives when I met with them to discuss the idea. My first meeting was with Bob Allen, the vice president of Disney MGM Studios, who oversaw all the production inside the sound stages there. I sat down and explained what we did, telling Bob that I'd like to produce all of our syndicated shows inside one of his sound stages, Keep in mind that part of Disney MGM's business was trying to attract outside television production. They wanted to keep those sound stages full. Tourists would go in and see actual television shows being produced, which made the studio a draw for the park, and of course the companies using the studios were charged a good sum for the facilities. Bob loved the idea of wrestling at Disney, but he knew that he had to sell it to his superiors because it would be controversial. The word doesn't quite cover it. Radical, maybe? Insane was probably closer. Professional wrestling and Mickey Mouse had never been uttered in the same sentence before. 2 or 3 weeks later, myself and another WCW executive, David Crockett, went down for a follow-up meeting with some of the more senior Disney people. We were surrounded by a dozen very corporate, very Disney-esque execs. I could tell by looking at them that most of these guys had no desire to see 300-pound guys running around in wrestling tights at Disney World. After all the introductions, I began the presentation. The more I talked, the more uncomfortable the Disney people got. When the meeting started, they were all looking at me, making eye contact, shoulders square to me, receptive, or at least not openly hostile. Halfway through the meeting, most of the people in the room were turned 90 degrees away from me. It was a small room, so they couldn't quite turn their backs, but if they could have, they would have. These executives have a very strict view of the Disney brand, and what worked and what didn't. I felt like I was selling ice cubes to Eskimos. To be fair, they did have some cause for concern. Wrestling, and WCW in particular, had been positioned as very violent and got a little bloody at times. That wasn't the Disney way. I had to convince them that things wouldn't be nearly as violent as they'd seen on the TBS cable side of things. The syndicated show had always been more family-friendly. We'd make sure it was even more so. The meeting didn't go well, but Bob Allen was still pretty enthusiastic. We must have gone to work on his bosses because after a third meeting we managed to convince them to give it a try. But the Disney people did give us rules. Firstly, I had to promise that the wrestlers would be bussed in. We were coming down there with 60 or 80 wrestlers at a time. They didn't want wrestlers parking in the lot and walking over to the sound stages. It wasn't just a logistical issue. Basically, they didn't want us to be seen. They asked if it would be possible not just to bus our guys in, but to cover the windows so people couldn't see them. I wasn't going to do that, but we agreed to bus everybody in because that part made sense. Everyone coming in their own cars would be too chaotic. Also, they said, we don't want the wrestlers walking around the park. When they're here, they have to stay in the sound stage. We don't want the guests to see a bunch of scary-looking wrestlers walking around. Okay, I didn't tell them that. I had enough people fighting the idea without telling everyone that we had to hide when we were there. I knew what we were up against with Disney, so I asked Turner's research department to come up with some research to overcome that negativity. We distributed questionnaires to everyone who came to the first shows and asked them questions designed to tell the Disney people that the WCW experience was a good one. 90% of the questionnaires came back positive. We asked questions we knew would allay the exec's fears. Did your children enjoy the show? Do you feel comfortable bringing your kids back to another WCW event? Do you have anything negative to say about the show? People said things like, it was the most fun we'd had at the park, great time, and so on. I gathered up all this research for my next meeting with the Disney executives. We walked through some of the logistical issues we had, like catering, simple stuff. Then I said, oh, by the way, here's what your guest said about the experience. When I came back to negotiate the second set of tapings, the Disney executives who had objected to having WCW earlier had changed their tune. Now they were excited about having us. They still wanted me to bust the wrestlers in, but they let us film in other parts of the park. Jesse the Body Ventura could interview people in Epcot and other areas. They let us out of the box. Well, they didn't let us into the Magic Kingdom, where the rides were. Maybe they were afraid we'd break something expensive. But otherwise, we had our run of the place. Okay, so let's look at some of the key takeaways from that passage. One of the things that I really admire most about this is that for all of Bischoff's perceived negatives and his faults, he was someone that was really immersed in wrestling and understood the business, but he also sat outside of the wrestling bubble. He talks a lot in his book about not being considered, at this point in his career, a wrestling guy, and that being both a plus and a negative. Really, he was able to approach the business in a different way, and that vision often helped the industry as a whole grow, which was fantastic. I also really connected with Bischoff's description of how Disney execs, and probably more generally just non-wrestling fans, view professional wrestling. It's still something that I feel all wrestling fans deal with today. Not just those within the industry and trying to sell its corporate value, but just trying to justify it as a form of entertainment. Normal fans. I too struggle with the existence of gratuitous violence and deathmatch wrestling, not because I'm particularly prudish or even squeamish, but because in my view it really devalues the art form. There's really very much nuanced storytelling that allows you to suspend your disbelief during any match that I've seen that involves one person allowing another person to hit them with light tubes or whippersnippers and ridiculous things like that. Finally, it was whilst they were taping these shows at the Disney MGM studios that WCW also made their first contact with Hulk Hogan. He was working on a separate television show at the park at the same time. So, it could be argued that without the Disney deal, WCW and Eric Bischoff may never have signed Hulk Hogan, and the history of the wrestling industry could look a whole lot different. No NWO, no Monday Night Wars. If you haven't already, I would really highly recommend Bischoff's book, Controversy Creates Cash. Let me know what you thought about WCW's deal with Disney in the comments below, and if you'd like to see more content about the research and the pivotal moments in wrestling history, then please like this video, share it with your friends, and also subscribe. Until next time, this has been One Full Theory, where we smarten up and smack down.